innovation and creativity are central to entrepreneurship. But what happens when you go beyond the edge? The Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast brings you the world's first, the disruptive, the avant-garde. We take you to the frontier in conversation with the entrepreneurs who are the forerunners of the industries of the future. Get to know their world with co-hosts Braden Kemp and Tracy Morningstar.
Canadian social enterprise is being recognized for providing sustainable, fresh produce to remote communities across Northwestern Ontario. When we look to the rugged expanses of our Canadian Shield, do we see indoor agriculture as a solution to the challenges of food security? Today, we begin to answer that question with Benjamin Feagin Jr., CEO of AgriTech North.
Welcome to the Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast. I'm Braden Kemp. I'm here with my co-host, Tracy Morningstar.
Good morning.
And today we're excited to welcome Ben Feagin from AgriTech North, a company dedicated to solving food security issues in Northern Ontario through advanced vertical farming. Ben, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thank you.
Maybe we get started. Could you tell us a little bit about AgriTech North and how or why you started the company?
Yeah. My life and business partner, Fabian Velez, and I met while I was a research scientist in Portland, Oregon. He's a botanist, and I largely decided to move back to where we are in Dryden, Ontario, due to family. I was lucky enough that he decided to follow me up here, and when we moved back, Dryden's a rural community. It's not like I would find a national lab here for employment, so we decided to start our own venture and try and make the biggest social impact we could while pursuing a dream.
Awesome. And I guess as a follow-up, you have a social mission stated on your website of reducing fresh produce costs in far north and Indigenous communities by 25% and then increasing availability in those communities year-round of fresh produce. What needs to happen to achieve that mission, and how is it kind of playing out compared to how you expected?
This was always a lofty goal. It's kind of what drives our organizational mandate, and the region that we're trying to impact continues to grow. I think that Northwestern Ontario is probably one of the more challenging areas to achieve this mission because there's not any underlying infrastructure to rely on, like in other areas of Ontario or even Canada. It's a good proving ground for these technologies. I think the most challenging thing has been that lack of infrastructure and also perception that there's no innovation in the Northwest. And so many of the programs that are available to other regions are not available in Northwestern Ontario, and we end up having to leverage other programs that are tangentially related to what we're doing in order to achieve innovation in the North. This has hampered our ability to progress and grow as an organization. And I'm Northwestern Ontario Métis community. We're in rights-bearing territory where this facility is located. We have a living lab. It started as 4,400 square feet, but it's about 10,000 square feet now. We've done a $4 million expansion with multiple grow technologies in order to show that multiple different crops can be grown in the same facility using different growing technologies. And we're trying to show like what certain technologies are good at and what they're not good at by illustrating them all in the same facility. And education is really important to us. So we're doing a lot of training programs. There isn't currently a year-round agriculture training program anywhere in Canada. And this has created a lot of staffing limitations. Everyone that we hire, essentially, we have to train from the ground up. And this is true for any controlled environment agriculture business. We have a pending funding application to develop the first of its kind as far as a formal training course delivered by third parties. So we're not a bottleneck to training, and it's not manufacturer or system specific. And so this is a huge barrier for food sovereignty in the North as well, because any community trying to establish food sovereignty or food security is going to run into the barrier of lack of access to education or knowledge in regards to how to operate these facilities. because there just isn't currently a source. So I think skilled labor or skilled even entrepreneurship in this sector is a big barrier to proceeding.
You mentioned facility a couple of times there. Sort of quickly, what style of facility you're operating out of? Is this something modular, or you built something more permanent?
We did over a year of market research and business planning in this sector, and saw, for example, these modular setups as repeatable, not scalable, because you're just duplicating equipment, right? That's not the definition of scalable. Scalable means that you have savings as you expand, and you have better economies of scale. You have more efficient equipment, but that doesn't exist if you're just duplicating a piece of equipment over and over or a setup. And so through that process, we took over an old municipal structure and essentially renovated into a federal grade research lab. And that's kind of the model that we're trying to use to show that, derelict structures, and especially in shrinking rural and remote communities, can be put to a better purpose, and can be renovated into something that's useful and potentially taxpaying, right? That's what our whole model is about. And when we started in this industry, we quickly realized that control environment agriculture is rife with false marketing claims. Nothing performs as claimed to. We're not a manufacturer yet, and we've utilized, tested multiple different growing technologies from multiple vendors, and none of them so far have actually lived up to their yield or environmental expectations or claims. This quickly had me lean on my research scientist background in order to innovate around the issues. And so many of our innovations are specifically geared towards reducing energy costs or labor overhead in order to address this issue of financial sustainability. So that way these operations can stand on their own 2 feet without essentially just being paid, 90% plus out of public funds in order to actually be viable.
That's some really interesting insights there.
Many people might not understand the distinction between organic and hydroponic produce. How do you educate your customers about these differences and solidify the value of your products?
Ooh, this is a heated question. We get both positive and negative feedback about our tagline, which is better than organic. This is not a marketing slogan purely. We did over a year of market research and business planning to land on this phrase. So organic means different things in different countries. That's the first thing to understand. And in the States, hydroponics and aquaponics qualifies under their rules as organic. If you use, the products and methods illustrated in the organic policies. However, in Canada, it's been specifically excluded under the principle that in order to be organic, you must be, quote unquote, a steward of the land. And since there's no soil in hydroponic and aeroponic, they are specifically excluded in multiple ways from Canadian organic definitions. So we cannot ever achieve organic, whereas in the States we could. As a result, this has generated our tagline, better than organic, because we do use organic principles. We use no chemical fungicides, herbicides, pesticides. We use 90% less water, 60% less nutrients. We, by all definitions, exceed the quality of organic, and we use 99% less land base. In our 2,000 square foot of grow space, we produce year-round the equivalent of 5 acres. And there's not enough arable land in the world for everyone to eat an organic diet. So organic is an elitist crop. Some people must go hungry for someone to eat organic. So we came to this realization through our research, and the whole reason that we have the tagline of better than organic is specifically to stimulate discussion around this topic and to potentially change the policies around organic to account for this. We see vertical farming as a method of achieving organic diets for a worldwide population, because now you can actually dedicate your arable land base to field crops like wheat, right? That won't really, for a very long time, be viable in vertical farming. But we need the buy-in from the organic committees and the people who are making those policies to start seeing this technology or this capability as an essential part of expanding the organic market base and the capacity of organic to meet a global need, and not be fighting against it, right? Against conventional crops that have the capacity to feed the world. We don't think that there should be this fight or this ebb and flow. We just need to figure out how to get these policies changed, and it's a whole nother initiative on our political and lobbying side.
Are you seeing any movement there?
We see it from the context of people challenging our tagline, but I think that there's still I don't think we're big enough in order to generate this kind of change. As we grow as an organization, we're becoming more and more involved in politics, and because to create change, we find that we can't just do it at the grassroots level. We need to draw attention to what we're doing up at the higher levels where policies are made. And so we're constantly having to be the tail on the dog, so to speak, and shake up policy making and procedures and things of this nature. But we haven't made much headway in the organic. We just continuously get shut down. There's like not even a willingness to speak at this juncture from our current exposure. However, we're probably just not exposed to the right people. So we continue to search for the right venue, for the right people to be able to create this kind of change, so we can change our slogan to something else. But for the time being, it'll be its own certification mark in order to continue driving this change in the marketplace.
I like that. Talking a little bit about quality over quantity, given the nutrient deficiencies associated with over-fertilization in traditional farming, how does your approach to nutrient management lead to healthier produce that retains more vital vitamins and minerals for consumers?
Another heated topic, in my opinion. So there's a lot of marketing claims about this. And what I can point to that's stable data is prior studies that have been done that show that food that has spent longer in transportation has less nutrient content because it's breaking down. In many of our rural and remote communities, we don't have food terminals or distribution centers, so we get product that's, a day to 2 days, sometimes 3 days from spoilage if we're in the middle of growing season, right? So the nutrient content is unarguably less than something that was picked fresh. So our farm, essentially, when you come into the retail space or when you order online, it's literally harvested just before you get it. Right, so it's fresh picked. We don't leave anything on the shelf to spoil, so there's no spoilage either. And so from that perspective, yes, but it's not speaking to your other question, which is as far as hydroponics delivering the ideal nutrients as opposed to over-fertilization and potential nutrient lockout. This, I don't believe there's ample enough data to point to specifically show conventional versus hydroponically grown. There are for certain crops, like lettuce is well studied. But generally our targets for the nutrient content of the plant is defined by Plant Analysis Handbook, which is like a reference manual for when you send a plant off for nutrient testing to make sure that your nutrient profile is good. We base what we give the plants off of that manual, which both conventional and hydroponic refer to, which would give the impression that the nutrient content is the same. But this hasn't been shown. well. And so one of the things that we're working on is that Northwestern Ontario doesn't currently have a testing facility for us to send plant samples to. And more often than not, our samples don't make it to Southern Ontario for testing. They spoil. Even if we ship them overnight, it takes like a week to get there. And so by that point, regardless of how we pack it, it's bad. And it's not reflective of the actual nutrient content for the customer. So what we're working on right now with the province and the feds is establishing testing facilities in Northwestern Ontario, in order to be able to actually test what's on the shelf here, not in an urban center that's close to a lab, what's on the shelf here versus what's in the farm. And then that way we can actually have an apples to apples comparison, literally and figuratively. And so that's our next step that we're moving towards, because we tend to never use marketing slogans or marketing claims like this unless there's a scientific backing to it. And this is a decision we made early on because of the rife false claims in the controlled environment agriculture industry. We're really trying to establish ourselves as a rock in the industry that is referring specifically to proven and tested data. And again, this comes back to my background as a research scientist leading the organization.
What's the magnitude of cost associated with bringing those testing capabilities to where you are in the north? Is it a full build out of a facility, or is there off the shelf equipment that you can purchase and bring into the system?
So generally, we're asking research questions that can't be answered with an off-the-shelf piece of equipment. These are very complicated issues, and to give you and this is why they're not easily solvable, and they haven't been solved yet. If we could just buy some meter off the shelf and go and measure something and answer the question, it probably would have been done already. But the reason that the issues that we're tackling are not tackled is because they're expensive and complex, and multivariate generally, which means there's multiple variables that have to be resolved at the same time, which scares academics. That's very against the academic methodology of research and development, where you should be doing single variate testing, right? Very controlled environments, and that's just not how things work in the real world. So it's not always transferable. That's the issue. So this means that, for example, one of our technologies that we've patented is multi-layer thin film greenhouse structure. It shows promise in the body of knowledge and the research to half the cost of heating it in the winter in comparison to double pane glass, which is a significant improvement and will completely change the controlled environment agriculture industry across Canada, potentially the entire agriculture industry. And we're not talking these innovations being incremental or slightly increasing capacity or being a very expensive solution, because this solution is also, once a developed industry, cheaper than double pane glass. So we're talking about lowering capital and operating costs. However, to do this research, everything is custom. So the greenhouse structure every piece was manually made by a local welder, because it's never been done before. The greenhouse industry hasn't been innovated upon in over 50 years. And everybody is looking at, trying to control the crops or the plants or the additives or artificial intelligence or robotics. But they're really this comes back to my Department of Energy expertise. Nobody's looking at the envelopes. Nobody's looking at the infrastructure and saying, this doesn't make sense. Like, why are we bleeding out all this heat and then trying to make it up in energy efficient lights? Right. So it just doesn't make any sense. And so that's the kind of thing that we're targeting, right? But this is not an envelope technology, a building science technology is not a cheap endeavor. We're talking about, greenhouses on the low end in Southern Ontario start at like $10 million, and go up to over $100 million usually. And so this is not an inexpensive endeavor to innovate upon. And so the greenhouse that we currently have, I think the envelope alone was over $500,000. Just to build, 2,200 square feet, because everything's custom. So it doesn't make sense from an economy of scale in the research phase. And that's why there's different, research support programs, and funding, because, there's an understanding in the research and development field that things aren't financially sustainable at the front end of research. And it'll never be commercially viable at that scale, and being built like this. But the long-term goal for it is to pass through commercialization so that we have a standard system of parts that can be mass produced to lower costs. And our whole goal is for everything to be manufactured in Canada, because it's funded by Canada. So our goal is for everything to be manufactured in Canada because it's funded by Canadian public dollars. One of the things we're observing is that, organizations receive a lot of public funding, and then they export the manufacturing or production, and the jobs go out the window, right? And also in Southern Ontario, more than 70% of the crops produced in Southern Ontario are exported to the states. So we're consistently beating the drum that pouring more money into research and development in Southern Ontario is just supplementing American incomes. So why are we doing it down there? It's not solving food insecurity. It's just lining pockets. And so we're constantly trying to change the status quo. We're told that, those organizations generate the largest farm gate receipts, but we have no farm gate in Northwestern Ontario, Northern Ontario, with no food terminal that's calculating these things. So the entire way in which funding is metricized is counter to food security and food sovereignty. And so this requires a huge infrastructure change as far as how funding is metricized and dispersed and targeted. And we continue to try and lobby for this with ministers when we have the opportunity to speak with them. But we're only one party, and we're not trusted alone, or we're not acted upon alone. So, venues like this help us create more awareness about the issues in this industry.
Fascinating. I want to just go back to something you said in the last response around cost reduction and efficiency. We've seen a number of very large, very well capitalized companies in the controlled environment ag space fail recently, in some cases spectacularly, from multi-billion-dollar valuations. What do you see holding controlled environment ag back from becoming a really standard production method?
I think there's too much focus on robotics. There's all this capital investment and the very complicated equipment to maintain. And when you look at most of our communities, particularly across Canada, there's not readily accessible robotics technicians. And so when you talk about scalability in the context of this industry and ready access, all this complicated machinery and equipment is not going to fly. Many of our innovations are also trying to reduce the reliance on skilled labor. So, for example, we're departing from the status quo refrigerant-based air conditioning and dehumidification, and going with purely thermal, like non-refrigerant thermal fluid base. So that way we eliminate any necessity of a refrigerant technician, which is a red seal trade. Very rare, even in a highway community like Dryden. To be able to, and no one responds to an urgent issue that could threaten your farm. So just imagine a flying community. And our air conditioners, by the way, fail probably every 2 to 3 months. And so you can't, that's about the length of a crop. So how are you supposed to operate a facility in a rural or remote community without ready access to a red seal trade that's a refrigerant technician? How are you supposed to actually have anything that's economically viable? And how are you supposed to actually keep that facility running? It's impossible. So That's another one of our technicians is climate control using non-refrigerant thermal fluids in order to allow people in the communities to maintain their own equipment and to manage it themselves. And so I think this is, this focus on hyper technology as the solution may work in urban centers. But once you extend beyond that, it's not. And I think also the multi-billion-dollar evaluation companies as well, some of them were weed oriented, and that's, that's an obvious reason, the overstimulation of that market or overpopulation of that market. But also I think that all of them are using the same things. Like they're all using the same technologies. They're all using the same base methodologies. They build their structures similarly. They use the same AC, air conditioning, and dehumidification technology. They're using like a lot of the same base growing systems, but they have some innovation in AI that's supposed to save everything with like a marginal 5% increase in operations or something like that. And they get all this money for something that's marginal. And then it tanks because it's not scalable. Right. Or because for one reason or another. And so those are the issues we're trying to address. And we have trouble attracting $1 million, let alone $100 billion, but largely because we're equity averse. And so we don't have any private equity investors right now, because we also see that equity investors tend to want to drive the organization. And many of those organizations that they have been driven into the ground. Because they're mostly focused on ROI and they want their money now. And the fact is that research and development takes time. And you can't force innovation. Sometimes you have to iterate in order to get it right. And that means waiting. And so we're largely looking at patient capital. And organization that shares the same outcome measure of food security, food sovereignty, not profit, because that is what we want to deliver on. That is our target. And if someone shares in that outcome, then that's what we're looking for. But we see these organizations often also driven in opposition to what will make them work because somebody has an ulterior motive, right? And we don't want to be a statistic. So we're very careful about this, especially in light of how many bankruptcies there have been. And frankly, if we were managed by just, a regular farmer, we would have been bankrupt in our first year because all of the equipment we received didn't work when it arrived. I had to manually rewire the equipment and modify it in order to get it working. We started post-COVID when manufacturing QA/QC was just non-existent. And so nothing we received worked. And so had we not the capacity and leadership at our startup phase that we did, we would have went bankrupt. So I'm not surprised. It's more shocking that people go and raise that kind of money and then still fail due to mismanagement. And I have a feeling that that's largely due to, too many motivations, too many hands in the leadership pulling in different directions.
Yeah, it's an interesting insight.
I've spent many winters in your area. I lived in Fort Frances for many years, and I'm familiar with the harsh climate. However, this year has been very warm.
Oh, yes.
I was just wondering, what are some of your concerns when it comes to temperatures, climate control, that sort of thing?
There's a marketing claim in the controlled environment agriculture industry that they are insulated or not impacted by the ambient conditions, and that's simply not true. The reason being is that the equipment has tolerances in which it prefers to operate. And if you have shifting climates and you have these extreme conditions, the equipment fails or it's pushed too hard and it fails due to maintenance issues. And so that's a reality we're dealing with, and that's largely why our equipment fails, is because in these extreme environmental conditions, the equipment just can't keep up, and it's running 24/7, and it does not like to do that. But it's either the equipment or the plants, and so it's you have to make decisions, right? And so that being said, as it gets warmer, that's of course beneficial for land-based crops and greenhouse crops. I think that it becomes more challenging in a vertical farm environment because vertical farms generate way too much heat. So we run in 2,000 square feet, more than 15 tons of air conditioning 24/7 because of how much heat these generate. Because 85% approximately of the energy that goes into lighting gets converted to waste heat. And that's considered an very efficient lighting source. And so you can imagine some of the farms not using LED, using other things, that ratio is even worse. And so as it gets warmer, these facilities will continue to fail as far as the equipment is concerned, because the equipment is stressed out even more due to the heat load on the building, right? And in the winter conditions, the vertical farms perform better, but then it's a challenge for the greenhouse. And that's why we're innovating greenhouse technology, right? And from Southern Ontario to the Arctic, this greenhouse technology will have benefits. Whether, like, most of the Southern Ontario has crops under cover already, greenhouse technologies, right? And that's because it increases yield for the land base. We can improve that even significantly more. But again, our focus is Northern Ontario. It's Northern Canada. While it will have benefits to Southern Ontario, that's not our focus, because the challenge is here. And if we can solve the problem here, which is far more challenging than Southern Ontario, which shares a longitudinal line with California, by the way, if it works up here, it can work for the Arctic. And so that's why we've chosen it here. That's why the Living Lab is here. That's why we're proving the technology here, because Californian technologies aren't going to be easily transferable to the north.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about how you have taken on a lot of the responsibilities. However, I do believe you do have a group called your Food Security Champions. Can you share a little bit about their diverse skills and passions?
Yeah, I suppose all of our team is really food security champions. One of our social purposes is workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're 100% DE&I staff. We have about a 50-50 gender split. And some of our staff are remote from Alberta to Quebec, and more than half are here at our Living Lab. And that team will grow. Next year, we're so far planning to double in size. And that's largely around our research and development. As far as our food security champions are concerned, many are driving to the communities. Our relationships with the communities and the community members and community leadership is very important. Yesterday, I just got back from an Indigenous conference in Rainy River. That was specifically around food sovereignty. And so we wrote a food sovereignty mandate that Grand Council Treaty 3 passed in the spring session of last year with a 5-year work plan. And so our relationship with the Indigenous peoples as well as immigration candidates is important. We feel that diverse opinions, diverse cultures makes our organization stronger. We have a gentleman from India. We have a couple young gentlemen from Ukraine. We have a couple people from Mexico. But instead of being part of the typical agricultural temporary foreign worker program, which also all of those workers are not protected by the Employment Standards Act, they're excluded and are not entitled even to minimum wage, breaks, lunches, nothing. Instead of that path, all of our staff make over a living wage. They have long-term gainful employment and a path to permanent residency. So we fully depart from the typical agricultural immigration participation. And through that long-term participation of these candidates, we develop a very diverse culture of sharing within our organization, and appreciation for those cultures and what they bring to the table. And the food is amazing. So, you can one day, one of your Mexican teammates could be making tacos or such for you from just like home. And the next day you're having curry. This is especially in a rural community, we're starving for diverse foods. It's not like going to an urban center. So it's a breath of fresh air, and it makes us, in my opinion, stronger as a team.
Ben, you mentioned relationships with communities and community members in your geography there. What do these relationships look like, and how do they shape the strategy of the business?
So being Indigenous myself, as Northwestern Métis community, are the underlying principles of our organization and how we function and operate is rooted in Indigenous knowledge and pathways. And so our relationship to the Métis community, for example, is regional in the sense that Métis Nation of Ontario, we call it Region 1. We have a separate division called Northwestern Métis Community, and so we have regular meetings, and we participate in food box programs, and so we do a lot of outreach. And with Indigenous communities, we have year-round growing units in the local schools, even within Indigenous communities. And we go and we visit those and help them learn how to use it and make sure that they're growing each year or each semester, and incorporating that in the classroom. We develop curriculum to directly replace Ministry of Education curriculum instead of fighting for extracurricular time. And it's automated, so that way it's not putting a burden on the teacher, right? And so in Indigenous communities in particular, we're there probably every week. We're in another Indigenous community, or delivering food boxes, or what have you, or supporting the schools, supporting community gardens. And so I think that, there is no terminus, there is no end to relationship building with communities. People are always changing, leadership is always changing. So there's no I don't think we'll ever be at a point where it's like, I have a relationship with XYZ. I think that that's something that's maintained over time. And if you stop maintaining it, you lose that relationship. It's not something you achieve. It's something you develop over time and maintain. So that being said, with that headspace, we're constantly supporting however we can, constantly engaging in whatever way we can to develop a culture around food sovereignty and prepare people for recovering what was lost. History of agriculture in this region by Indigenous peoples, and implementing recovery strategies as well for the natural landscape. Where were the strawberry patches? Where were the blueberry patches? Where were the raspberry patches? And trying to get that back, so that way, there's land-based and culture-based relevance, and playing a role in that, and how do we assist in and bringing the landscape back to what it was before, clear cutting.
I was just thinking about the landscape and how it's changed over the years. And, as an Indigenous person, I was just wondering about your conversations when you were talking with Treaty 3. What is their primary concern looking into the future?
Ooh, that changes from community to community. The Grand Council is a political body, and largely defaults to the voices of individual communities. And so I would hesitate to speak on their behalf, because generally that even their voices typically defaulted to the communities. Mm-hmm. But in the conversations we have participated in, I think the loss of intergenerational knowledge is a huge barrier because of the prior persecution of Indigenous peoples for practicing agriculture, and the removal of all assets that were accumulated in the agricultural industry by force, where the capital doesn't exist. Indigenous peoples and communities can't own the land or the house or what have you, so they have no equity base to leverage. So I think this generates a huge barrier where people don't know where to start, and they don't have the tools to start And this is where I find that they're looking for help, and that's the gap we're trying to fill, is the knowledge base, assistance in guiding the process of research and being of assistance however we can to recover what their communities did before persecution, and seeing if we can't play some role in that. Climate change, of course, may make some of those things irrelevant, because we may not be able to do certain things anymore because the climate has changed. And then figuring out how we compensate for that. What do we do now? But really the communities lead this. It's not my place, or frankly, in my opinion, anyone else's place to tell them what to do, or to tell them how to deal with that. So we largely just play a supporting role and do whatever we can to support their decision.
Ben, I think that's a really inspiring message for us to close on. And thanks so much for joining us today. It's been an eye-opening conversation, and I really appreciate your deep knowledge, not only on the business, but also about the ecosystem and the technology and the communities involved. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Miigwech.
We'll be right back after this short break.
The Canadian Council for Indigenous Business builds bridges between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, businesses, and communities. Head to ccib.com to help build a new economy based on mutual respect and shared prosperity.
We return to the Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast with co-hosts Braden Kemp and Tracy Morningstar.
Tracy, that was an incredible learning experience for me. And it's hard to pick out something to close on, but there's two statements that Ben made that really stood out to me. The first is modular is repeatable, not scalable. And that's an interesting insight, because we hear modular all the time as a sort of like a selling point for innovative technologies, but maybe there's something deeper that we're missing. And the second statement is you can't force innovation. Sometimes you have to wait. And that sounds to me like something that a true innovator would come up with. The team at AgriTech North is running a business here, of course, but it seems like it's a lot more than that.
It's so interesting, his truth telling, because it plays a critical role in promoting transparency and accountability when it comes to that huge responsibility of food insecurity. Also fostering integrity that empowers not only the individual, but also the communities that he's so thoughtful about.
I think thoughtful is the word. It's more than just a business, and they really do seem to be thinking carefully about all of the things that they're working on.
Well, we'll be off for the summer, but you're sure to find us back in the map room, in the stacks, at our desks, planning the next mission.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank our guest, Ben Feagin, again for joining us. I want to thank you, Tracy, for another great conversation. And as always, I want to thank everyone for listening. We'll see you next time on the Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast.